This is the Old Testament overview. Thank you. This is the Old Testament overview. I have given you a sheet that looks like this, and it has all the. And I'm going to actually hold it. I'm going to put it up there for you, and you, so some of you will see. Let me just double check to make sure that actually is working. Here's the color version. All right. Can you see that at home?
Yes.
Yes.
We don't even need the bottom one there, so it's perfect. You are all on the bottom of the screen now. I don't, can you make that big? Yeah, I can make it bigger there. Did that get bigger for you?
Yes. Yeah, that's good.
Zoom?
Yes.
Is that good? You can all see that?
Yes.
Let me just check my my writing capacities here. All right, good. So we will journey through this together. But I do want to say just a few things, just that as we started at the beginning of this whole process of looking at this book, we've got this crazy idea to go through the Bible. I know me personally, it has been completely enriching. I felt like I was going back to seminary studying for cramming for exams and trying to figure out how these books fit together. And it's amazing how much you forget. So if you don't remember any of this, it's totally fine. You don't have to. It is there really just sort of, I've been looking to try to find a timeline, and most of them are so cluttered and barred and arrowy that you get to the point where it's like, I just can't even track. So I did like, this was one done by a homeschooling mom. You can see at the bottom where I got it from. It is for free. It does take us all the way up to Christ's birth. So we really don't need that last, for those of you who have in front of you, we don't need that last line. So just ignore that. But what I want to do in this chart that you all are looking at online and you all are looking at in person is I want to place all of the biblical books that we have looked at in this narrative structure. Because kind of what we did is we went through a narrative structure, and then we got into the wisdom books, and then we got into the prophets, and those all sort of fit and slot into the story. But sometimes just seeing where the prophets existed in the timeline of Israel is helpful. Yeah, there's more pencils there if you need them. But before we do that, I just kind of wanted to revisit the idea that the Old Testament for us is made up of 39 books. It is the same as the Jewish canon. The Jewish canon actually, though, wasn't what was the year that I wrote down? The Jewish canon had not been formed really until about the 400s. So if you're looking at this map, the 400s happened after Malachi down here. If you're looking at the very bottom, you use the pencil. 400 after that. So you have the beginning of the formation of the canon around this time. In other words, all of these books were oral tradition. They were written in fragments. We have lots of fragments, but really they didn't even solidify what books were considered holy for Israel until around that period. And then it wasn't even the final canonization didn't even actually happen until 200. So sometime between 500 and 400, you have that. And just to put that into context, 400 would have been when Alexander the Great was on the scene. And it was under his leadership that the Septuagint, which is the Bible in Hebrew being translated into Greek. So even at that time in that region, you have some influence from Greek culture starting. And that's important to note only because from that time on, where you have Malachi, it's going to basically, you're going to have more and more Greek influence on, is that why you erased that? There it goes. On that region of the country. And that is ultimately what shapes and helps change the New Testament. So we're going from a very narrative story of a nation who has journeyed through creation up to the point of their reestablishment after they return from exile, up to the point of Christ. And then because this Greek influence comes in, things change in the New Testament. So this marks the sort of beginning of that structure. So what we're going to do today, though, is I really want to go through the books of the Bible and show you not only in the narrative form, because really so much of this, like the first third of this or the first fourth of this page really is just Genesis and Exodus. But we want to go through those stories to kind of get the larger picture of how God moved in Israel's life. Just a reminder of a few things, that the Hebrew canon is broken up into something that they call the Tanakh, the Torah being the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch, the law. You have the prophets, the Nevi'im, and then you have the Ketuvim, which is the writings, and those are the wisdom books and the song books and the poetry books and the vignettes and these little episodes that come around, and all of them together form this thing that we call the Old Testament for us as Christians. But the Old Testament does contain, and as I said on Sunday, it does contain the story or the example of creation. We find that in Genesis, and Genesis really can be broken up into 2 chunks, 1 through 12 and 13 through 50. And in that first 12 chapters, you pretty much have creation, fall, all the way up to Abraham's promise. And it's important to establish that because something significant changes. You have, as we've looked at over the last year, we've looked at covenants and the way God has shaped Israel through covenants. And there are several key covenants. So one of them is here. You have the Adamic covenant that is right around creation. So God created Adam and Eve, and then God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And this was their task. Well, they rebelled against God, and the fall happened, as we talked about over the past few weeks. And the fall happens, and they get kicked out, and you can see they're crying, and they're being booted out of the garden. And then you have the really sort of the first sort of passing down of sin, and we see that exemplified in this. Although I don't know why it's this righteous Cain and Abel, but the story of Cain and Abel. And we also see the beginning of a cosmological structure of sacrifice that carries all the way through the history of Israel, all the way through the New Testament, and still 2,000 years after Christ, still permeates our understanding of the Christian faith, that Christ sacrificed himself so that we might be free. So when you think about the fact that we rely on our freedom based on a substitutionary sort of atonement, that goes all the way back to the very first humans and the way they responded to the divine. And I will say, if anyone has any questions along the way, just please interrupt. But things get bad, and God's going to destroy the earth, and he does. And then you have Noah, and you have sort of a break in the story. And on the other side of that, as they land after the 120 days of rain and 40 days of just floating around, or 40 days of rain, 120 days of floating around, and God gives the sign of the rainbow and makes a second covenant with humanity. And this is the Noahic covenant. And that Noahic covenant, says the same thing that Adam and Eve got: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Because the desire was, God wanted to spread out. And this was before that, like I said on Sunday, that Pangea, before the continents all sort of broke apart and split. So they needed people to spread out a little, so when they split, they could have different places to live. And so what you have in that idea of, and not only that, but meat was introduced. I think I like to always highlight that after the ark, and you have a dramatic drop in the life expectancy of humanity. Prior to that, you have people living in the hundreds and hundreds of years. Next, you have that people live in 100, 150 years. So by the time it actually get around to Abraham, it wasn't surprising that even though he was old at 100, it wasn't like he was a young pup back in the day when people were living to 600, 700 years old. You have the story of Job that is thought to maybe exist here. Other people, I would say somewhere between, I personally would put Job here. Around the time of Abraham. They don't really know when it is, and we'll come back to that, but I just want to kind of highlight that Job sort of fits into it. She put Job, the long-suffering servant, here. I don't necessarily know if that was, a lot of the sources I read actually said it was more in the time of Abraham. I like the fact that this narrative also includes the Tower of Babel, because there is a connection to that sense of the Babylonian Empire and that full circle. When you think of the fact that the Babylonians conquered southern Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah, that's full circle. But what you have in the Tower Babel is everyone coming together, everyone uniting, everyone trying to speak the same language, everyone being together, so that not that they could build a structure to God, so that they could unite. And the reason that God spread everyone out and sent them off is because they were a direct conflict to what God had covenanted with Adam and with Noah. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, go out. So that kind of actually marks a huge break in the story here. This is Job. Then you have God comes on the scene and decides to redeem all of creation through a person and through a line. And that's where God promises to Abraham and Sarah around, and it shows the date there around 2000. Some of these dates prior to really King Solomon's time, or some prior to you are getting a little fuzzy. So, but let's just say that go with that. The idea was that God made a third covenant with a specific people that would be designated, and God made 3 promises: a name, land, and descendants. So Abraham and God has accomplished that in these days, but throughout the whole story of the Old Testament, you have these measures of saying, okay, is the people being accomplished? Well, yeah, you'll see by the end of Genesis, the Israelites have prospered and they're thriving in Egypt, and that ultimately leads to their slavery. But that sense of people were there. The name Abraham was growing, and it had developed in that people, and it continues and extends to today. The only thing they didn't have at that point was land. But Abraham makes this covenant with God. Abraham has a misunderstanding, and that's the Hagar and Ishmael. And just a reminder that Hagar and Ishmael, that is where Islam comes from. So when we say there are 3 Abrahamic faiths, we have Judaism that comes from Abraham naturally. Christianity, we claim, because we've been adopted into that, and really to a more genetic extent, Islam would claim that they were the true promised line, because that was the next child born after God's promise to Abraham. But Abraham kicks Sarah and Ishmael out, and they go off. And then you have Sarah, and then they begin to establish a people. And so Sarah gives birth to Isaac. What's that? Is it a question? No. Sarah gives birth to Isaac, and this child that's going to fulfill the covenant. There's the narrative of the sacrifice of Isaac, and God tests Abraham, and there's different views of that, but the idea was that Abraham was going to put his trust in God. Isaac marries Rebecca, Isaac marries Rebecca, and they have 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau is the older one that should have had the birthright. Jacob is the younger one that did not. But through trickery, God uses Rebecca's trickery to trick Isaac into blessing Jacob. And this is a pretty key point in the story, because this is the first time now all of a sudden it seems like God is using the deceptiveness of humanity to accomplish his purposes and choosing who he wants. So he wants Jacob to be the line through which Israel comes into being, and just sort of put a pin in that, because Esau eventually establishes his line southeast of Israel. And if you turn your paper over, you should have a map. And here, I'll put it on the screen. Let me just switch. Can I do? No, I don't do that. Let me see. If you're looking on your map, can all you see at home can you see me on any screen, or is it just the big? See what happens if I do.
Yeah, we can see you now.
Let's go there. We'll do this. Okay. So on this map, what's his name? Esau settles down here in Edom. And so the whole line of Esau becomes the Edomites. And if you'll recall, the Edomites were chastised by, what was the prophet? I don't even remember. Where was it? Edomites. It was one of the smaller ones. Micah, maybe. We'll come to it. Edomites. Obadiah. So Obadiah, one of the minor prophets, ultimately his prophecy comes against the Edomites because they, as the Israelites were fleeing Jerusalem up here, as they were fleeing to get out, the Edomites were catching them and taking them back to the Babylonians. And so they ultimately will suffer a harsh fate for that. But here we have a clean slate. Nice. All right. But so Esau and Jacob happen, and then Jacob has the vision of the ladder and gets renamed Israel and has this encounter with this divine angel. Jacob has 12 sons, and you know the story. Joseph is the coat with many colors, and everyone was jealous of him, and he prophesied and gave visions. And then his brothers decided not to kill him, but to sell him into slavery, which this was God using evil for good, because when Joseph was sold into slavery, he was given favor in Pharaoh's court. And that gave him the capacity to welcome in all of the Israelites in that region of the world that were sort of spread. And at that time, if you look at the larger map, if you just know where sort of Jerusalem is, they ended up coming down here into Egypt, because this is where the slave traders went down there and took Joseph down there. So all of the Israelites from this upper region came down and settled into Egypt, and they grew in prosperity. So you have this kind of break. If you're looking at your picture here, you have this break sort of around here. Oops. Here, this signifies the break between Genesis and in Exodus. Oh, actually, I take that back. Not right there. The next one over here, Israelites in slavery. And so that's where you have Genesis tells the story from that goes this way, and Exodus picks up the story this way. So that's just the first book of the Bible. But that contains three of the covenants that we use to understand who we are in terms of relationship to Israel and God's covenant with all of humanity. So what happens after that is 400 or roughly 400 years of slavery, and then you have Moses sort of coming on the scene as the deliverer. Doesn't know it, raised in the Egyptian palace as an Egyptian. If you've ever seen the movie Prince of Egypt by Disney or DreamWorks, it's a fantastic, fairly accurate story. They do a great job with it. I would highly recommend it. But they go and Moses then, you know the story, he strikes down someone from trying to, he sort of has this realization of who he is and comes into this identity crisis, eventually abandons Egypt, goes off into the wilderness. God calls him in the burning bush. Now that burning bush narrative that comes in Exodus is a pretty key text throughout all of Scripture, because this is where God introduces himself to the world, to Israel. Since Abraham, you have God's appearance, you have angelic encounters, but God finally gives himself a name in the forms of Yahweh, which means I am that I am. And it's the ultimate statement of existence. And as we were talking even on Sunday, just that everything came into existence through God's being. This is exactly, when Moses says, "Who are you, God?" He's not saying I'm a person. I'm not saying, he's just saying I almost as if he's saying I am existence. I am everything. It is an encompassing statement of who he is. And so this is a massive revelation. And not only that, but I neglected to start with this because we should have been tracing it all the way through. You have this theme of presence that exists. And so in this creation account up here, you have great presence, very close, God's dwelling in the garden. And then you have this fragmentation of the fall. And then you have sort of this God that's way up here in the clouds, because they're offering sacrifices to the God in the clouds. And then you have a God that comes down momentarily, talks to Moses, comes down momentarily, talks to Abraham. And so you have this God that sort of pops in. And you see places where God is present, but you really don't see God's presence as any sort of regular form all throughout this. So the burning bush becomes this absolute personified manifestation of who God is. And is a pretty incredible one because of that identification. So Moses is convinced to go. You're looking at sort of, you can see the date there, 1446 BC. So you're talking about 1500 years roughly before King David, just to kind of give you an anchoring of time. So somewhere around the time of the fall of Rome, this was the plagues were happening, and then say David was coming on the scene around our present time. So a lot of time had passed. But you have the 10 plagues that come and that move the Israelites out. The Exodus happens. I'm going to just clear that screen by doing that, now that I'm learning how to do it. We'll go here. Crossing of the Red Sea, again, God's protection and provision. And you got to keep in mind that for many, is it still there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That for many, this is like so after these plagues, and they're seeing this happen, and they have this Passover, and they've been saved, and they're going through the Red Sea. What's that? Do you have something? Do you have a question, Donna? Are you playing Minesweeper?
I love your pictures. I'm just loving this.
Oh, good. So they cross over and they get on the other side, and this is still the Exodus. And then something happens. Israel starts complaining. They've been in slavery for 400 years, and they start complaining. They don't like the desert. It's too hot. There's nothing to eat. There's nothing to drink. Moses, brings water out of a rock. But then something significant happens. And the reason I think I want to stop here for a moment is even before we get into the 10 Commandments, because we often think the 10 Commandments are the most important thing, like around this time. And I actually, I don't want to say I'm a Sabbatarian, but spending a lot of time in my own studies in Sabbath, what happened with the manna in the heaven was not insignificant. It wasn't just about provision. It was since the beginning of time, since creation, seventh day rest, God stopped, God ceased, humanity stopped. They rested with God, they dwelled with God. They had not had that rest until that narrative again at the manna. So there was no sense of ever stopping. Every day was about survival. We don't understand that reality in our world, because you wake up and you're like, oh, I have a little bit of milk left. I'll just jump in the car and drive, and drive an hour and a half and go get some milk. But it was a constant battle to say, hey, where is our food going to come from? So God giving them food was not just about provision, but giving them food and then establishing on the seventh day that they wouldn't work at all. And this wasn't so they could hook up some camel skin hammocks and kick back and drink some, coconut pina colada sort of things. But it wasn't like this chill time. It was actually so that they could exchange their labor for rest, so they could dwell with God. And it was meant to sort of draw back to that garden experience where they walked with God in the cool of the evening. And Sabbath becomes the sign of this covenant that carries them forward, even into and defining the 10 Commandments, because the 10 Commandments, right at the center of that, you have that obey the Sabbath and keep it, obey the Sabbath and keep it holy, and not holy in the sense of perfect, holy in the sense of set apart. One day a week we're going to set apart. So in a reality, if we as a Christian church wanted to embrace the concept of a Sabbath, we would go about our business and do our work and do all the things we had to do. And one day of the week, we would gather together with other Christians, and we would say, you know what, it doesn't necessarily be the whole day, but we would say more than an hour on Sunday morning, or an hour and a half if you had some coffee in that. But we would say, we as a Christian community are going to spend a chunk of time together in Christian fellowship and learning and study, because we believe that that is what we're called to do as a community of faith. And then it shapes who you are. Now, this is what Jews do. This is why when there's a real concrete sense of Jewish identity, because they have these rituals, and these rituals go back to the very first ritual that it was not only, I guess, Passover would have been the sort of first festival established, but Sabbath was given to them as something they were required to do. Long before there was any 10 Commandments. Prior to the 10 Commandments, there wasn't like, God had to say, don't steal from your neighbor. Oh, I didn't realize that was a bad thing. don't, because no one had said anything and they didn't have the Holy Spirit there to kind of guide their morality. So you have this 10 commandments given, and this is the next covenant, the Mosaic covenant. Mosaic, that's not sloppy. That's not even worth putting up there because I can't even read it. So the Mosaic covenant, and this Mosaic covenant said, keep the Sabbath, keep the Decalogue, these 10 commandments, and follow me and show your allegiance to me, and I'll be with you. So there was a promise of this sense of presence. And what you have after that is the establishment, directly after this 10 commandments thing in Exodus, you have the establishment of the tabernacle. So now God was present with them. Actually, it happens right after the bronze serpent. That was, everyone was pretty bad. But the tabernacle runs through this period here. And then because in the Ark of the Covenant is where the tabernacle rested. So now Israel had a permanent sense of God's presence with them in that Ark of the Covenant that kept them there. And that ends the book of Exodus. And what you have really is right in here, you have, I'm just going to put the first letter, Numbers, Leviticus and Numbers. I don't know what that was. Leviticus and Numbers are right around here. And Leviticus, as you recall, and it's really fun kind of looking back at these notes just because they're a little stretchy up front. But Leviticus was establishing the Levi tribe as the priestly tribe. And so much of what you have in Leviticus is instructions around rituals, establishing Aaron and his sons as being part of this priestly covenant, the qualifications for being a priest, the ritual feasts that they were meant to participate in, and the introduction of the Day of Atonement, that they would be judged someday. Numbers is about the 40 years that the Israelites were in the wilderness. And so it chronicles this time sort of from about here to all the way up to almost the entry into the promised land. So Numbers picks up sort of around that storyline and carries that through. And again, Leviticus was not meant to be necessarily a storybook, although it does contain some story. It's really meant to sort of be an instructional book. Numbers picks up that story, and it gives all further instruction about how to organize the tribes and how to exist in that region. And then you have Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy sort of was probably written right around here, but it covers back farther, and so but it was written after the fact. Deuteronomy, that's my best there, and it really was sort of a reiteration of what was happening. Moses was still the authority, but it was written probably by the first judges that came along. It was really the sort of retelling. You have a massive retelling of the story up to this point, because it was meant to shape those Israelites that were in the desert. And it was that sense of, and you have this at various points and in various ways throughout the Old Testament. You'll see it again in Chronicles, but that sense of retelling the story, because it was a new generation about to enter the promised land. And that's where the book of Joshua starts. So you have Joshua that starts here. And although Joshua was probably written a little bit later, but you have this entry of this new generation into the promised land. Now Joshua picks up kind of where Moses left off, and they go in, and Joshua is trying to lead them into the promised land. They send the 2 spies in. That's why it goes here, and that's that first story of Rahab and letting the 2 spies out and allowing them. And you got to think again, if for those of you who have a map in front of you, that they were trying to, and really it was sort of over here, they were trying to cross over the Sea of Galilee into this region up here. This was Canaan. And in order to do that, they had to send these spies in. And you have, where is Jericho? I think right, Jericho, right above Jerusalem. So they're sending spies from this region over here to go over here, and this is the region they were trying to occupy. Can you all see that at home, or do I need to switch back to another one? Here, let me just for your sake here. Photos. Which one am I looking at? This one. So they were trying to cross over. They were over here, and really, if you look, they kind of, and if you remember, if you look at a wilderness map, they kind of go all over the place, and they were kind of really close to the promised land. But they're trying to cross over that, and Jericho becomes that city that is eventually conquered and falls after they've marched around it for 7 days. And this is the land of Canaan. And that's the land they're trying to occupy. And that ultimately where, not surprising, where Jerusalem is established. But they're trying to get over here. Put this timeline back up here. Okay. So they make it over into the promised land. They come over into the promised land. And it says false gods, because the first thing they did was Joshua. So they go over and then Joshua divides up the land between all the tribes and gives each different regions. But then stuff starts to happen and people start to assimilate with the Canaanites, and no one is really following what they're supposed to be doing. They weren't separating themselves. This new generation, this younger generation that were born in the wilderness, didn't get it. They somehow missed the message that they were supposed to be faithful Israelites at this point. So they kind of they marry up with the Canaanites. They have stuff, and then God's like, this isn't working. And so in this intermediary time of having this two sort of central figures of Moses and Joshua, without having someone sort of in a military conquest to follow, Israel begins to establish and begins to be governed by a set of judges. And these judges, it's a period that each regions have judges. And the judges begin to become corrupt, and some of them are good, some of them are bad. But you have Othniel and Ehud and Shammar and Deborah. And Deborah is one of the more significant judges because it was the first time, other than Miriam, that you have really significant leadership in terms of women in the Old Testament as well. Deborah becomes the first prophetess, and her emphasis is on justice. And then you have Gideon that follows, and Japheth and Samson, to name some of the more known ones. And Samson is executing God's judgment despite his failures. And so some of the judges were good, some of them are bad. They're kind of a precursor to the kings. They were there to orient Israel, and sometimes they did a good job of it, and sometimes they did it at a bad time. Throughout the book of Judges, you see this, you see the phrase, in those days, Israel had no kings. So again, it's thought that was written actually prior or after the time of kings, in sort of a retroactive reflection. But if you were to kind of do, you can see on the sheet, let me move it up here, make it a little bit bigger. Judges would have been written right around here. This would have been covered. This is the era that the book Judges would have been sort of prominent. Now Ruth follows actually after Judges, which is good because it does fall into the same time frame. But we're not going to hit Ruth right now because we're going to jump, because in the chronological order of the books, well, I guess you do have Ruth. Ruth comes right there. Ruth is a story of, and if you go back to, if you think of that map that I just showed you, rather than switching it back, Ruth is a story. And if you think about where the Sea of Galilee was, Ruth is a story of a Moabite woman, and you can, if you are looking on that map of yours, you can see where Moab is down here. Oh, here, I'll just do it. It doesn't take but a second. Photos here. So Moab is down at the bottom here. And what you had is you had folks who were after this time, during this time of the prophets, you had folks that were moving out here. And then when they did, and then what happened was Ruth's husband died, and she was married to someone Jewish, and then her father-in-law died, and so she betroths herself to Ruth and then returns to Israel with her. So they're kind of living in Moab, and then so Naomi takes back Ruth with her, and eventually gets to the place where Ruth is accepted by Boaz, after sitting on the threshing floor and sort of saying, hey, I'm your servant here, let me serve you. And this is a pretty key, significant event. Again, not only because Rahab was responsible, again, a Gentile, not someone from the Israelite line, who helped Israelites escape during the spies ordeal, but now you have Ruth, a Moabite, who actually becomes the great-grandmother of King David. So you have someone from outside of the line being brought in, and that's a pretty significant thing because you'll see that throughout the history of Israel, God occasionally including someone, and in the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew, as we'll look at in a few weeks, Rahab is included in that lineage. So Ruth becomes another figure and a woman in a time where women were very much sort of looked at as property, rose up, and really her courage and her passion, and it was one of those books that has had some question of whether or not it should have been included in the Torah or in the canon, the Israelite canon, but is included nonetheless. Samuel was probably written right about here. Oops. Well, you can see where it says Samuel. And you have, so Hannah was Samuel's mother, and she takes Samuel to the temple and offers Samuel to Eli. And you have that famous story of, he hears someone calling him, and I hear you calling in the night, and he says, I say, here am I, Lord. This couple of hymns are based off that idea. But Samuel really becomes sort of this first, he essentially is kind of a prophet and functions in that role, but he becomes the sort of first major priest or dignitary or sort of officiated figure, because he becomes the sort of person through which the kingship is ushered into Jerusalem and to Israel. So they want a king. They see King Saul. We talked about this a few weeks ago, this sense of like stature and physical appearance and how we put so much emphasis on it. The Israelites wanted King Saul to sort of be their king because he was great in stature, and then eventually he turns corrupt. And you have the beginning, and I want to point out that this, and I've often throughout this whole thing have said around 1000 is when King David was there, and you can see pretty close. It's a little bit before that, but that is.
We can't hear you, Jason. You froze up.
Samuel is probably written about. So you have over about the story of that way, and you have.
That's a shame.
Yeah. I mean, what a lot of work. He ought to have that published.
There he is. He's here. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
That's better.
You're frozen though.
That's better.
That's it was a little blip. All right, so we're at King David, right? 2 Samuel. I said 2 Samuel was written right about here, right about here. Now, for the other books, Psalms was really written probably starting around here because some of them go back to Moses' time. So Psalm actually has some dates of being written from 1400 to about 450, but they are largely composed here. So, and people associate Psalms with King David. And so those go right around there. And then you also have not naturally Proverbs right here. Right around King Solomon's time, but over all of this whole story is told between 1st and 2nd Kings, and it's kind of the line of the story of what happened of the kings. And here's the interesting thing about that is Kings really goes to where did I put it? All the way. I'm going to raise this up here. Hold on one second. Erase everything here. Kings goes all the way up to here, Daniel and technology. This is Daniel in the lion's den. So Kings covers the span of around the time of King David, all the way up to the fall of Jerusalem. So that's a giant swath. So if you really want what happened from Solomon all the way up to after the fall of the southern kingdom,
Really?
so the northern kingdom's in that, the southern kingdom's a massive period of time, then that is all found in Kings. And so a lot of these prophets that we have looked at over the last few months are actually fit into this next line as we go, and it's going to get a little messy as we go, because remember I said that it was about 1,000 when they anointed David as king of Israel, and then I should say God made a covenant with King David. So here's where you have the Davidic covenant, and this was the last covenant made with Israel, so to speak. Of course, the new covenant was made with Israel, but it applied much broader. And in that covenant, God said that he would never take his love away from David. He professed his eternal love. And so there was almost this certainty, which is important going into this time of tumultuous upheaval and good kings and bad kings and attacks and exiles, that this promise is what the entire nation sort of rode their existence on. This promise of a Davidic king to come. So that happens there. And then also, although a Song of Solomon's is probably here somewhere around right after, because of the fact that it was originated, it was attributed to Solomon, although other authors participated in it. Ecclesiastes, because of the fact that it said it was written by Ecclesiastes, because it was written by David's son, is often credited to King Solomon, but it is also thought that it was probably more written or rewritten or reestablished in 200. Now that's a major jump. That's almost a 700-year jump from when the time, or 800-year jump from the time when Solomon could have wrote that to the. So some people, just because it says it came from that, so the thought is that part of the Ecclesiastes might have drawn back from King Solomon's time, but because of the Gnostic and Epicurean and Greek influences on Israel at the time of around the 200, when you have that transition to the intertestamental time, you have a strong influence of this sort of Stoic philosophy of just let the world go around me and live, and I'll just live my life and be peaceful and deal with tragedy as it comes, so to speak. Let me reset that screen. Yes.
Where do you think, or maybe you actually know, or someone knows, where this started out as a narrative and then was actually written down? In other words, how long did it go before, physically you could pick it up and read it as opposed to hear it?
Sometime in the last, I would say, 400 years. One, literacy just wasn't the maintaining of these scripts. Most of this, and much like the Middle Ages period, I mean, is that most people couldn't read or write. So most of it was mediated by oral tradition or by the community. And by the time they had King David do it, you have scrolls that have been developed. So the last 1,000 years of Israel's history, you do have documentation of stuff that dates back further. I mean, Moses clearly is attributed to penning some of Israel's history for the first 5 books of the Bible, but Moses died probably around 1875 or and so really, and I would say prior to that, there probably was only fragments or really sort of passing down of written. And again, even in the writing, they didn't have vowels. It was a very rudimentary sort of writing. And so one of the things that I had to learn, so to graduate from seminary, I had to translate Greek and Hebrew. Don't ask me to do it now because I can't at all. But give me a month maybe to brush up and I can maybe fake it. But Hebrew has so much fluidity as a language and interpretation. And Old Testament scholars love to dig around in it because you can't just take the Bible for what it is. You really have to take the other documents that are around that time of history to try to fill in the blanks of what the world would have been like then, to understand how the Bible might have been surfaced or received in that time. But they say around 500 is when Jews first started to sort of solidify books and sanction them as being holy or set apart or canonize them. And then you have the final form in around 200. So it took about 300 years. And just a reminder of the New Testament books, books were sort of being written around the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s after Christ, but really we didn't canonize them or give them some sort of official status. Really, I want to say as early as 150 to about 300. And then even then, there's been debate various centuries later about which books represent, should books be in there, should Esther still be in the Old Testament? We eventually just took all of it from the Jews and put it into our canon. So we didn't do a lot of I would say in general, Christians probably did less discernment of the Old Testament books of whether or not they should be in there. And we were sort of taking them as we're being adopted into this faith. So we're going to take these books and incorporate them into our lives. But you have, so then you have these, is that any questions? Anyone on Zoom, questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Nora, nice and loud.
Um,
I'll repeat it, but.
Okay, my question is, there's examples on the time frame, I have to think about it. But Nehemiah and Ezra, where they read the word, what did they read it from? From memory?
No, if you can see down here, Nora, Ezra and Nehemiah, by that time, literacy was much higher. And that would have prompted the writing down and the archival nature of what they were doing. But Ezra and Nehemiah, they came back after the second temple was being built. So
they were thrown out of Jerusalem.
Well, no, they were sent actually by either Darius or by King Cyrus, have sent back to sort of help Jerusalem, establish Jerusalem and rebuild an identity as the Israel. But we'll come to them in a second. We'll come to them shortly.
What is the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the last century, I don't know, the 70s, 80s, maybe, the Dead Sea Scrolls, 70s, 80s, something around there. Some of them are manuscripts or fragments or parchments that do have scriptures related to them, but a lot of them were just a cultural literature that was found and that then paint a fuller picture of biblical times. So they're looked at as sort of para-biblical books in the sense of they are supplemental to the context of the biblical times.
Do they align with the Old Testament, New Testament, one or the other, or both?
Both. I mean, they're not meant to make claims about spirituality necessarily. Some do, but the vast majority of them are viewed as sort of sanctioning the context of the life there.
So it seems to me with all of this as it develops, today it's easy to know God, you read the Bible. And yet you have examples of the prophets where some descriptions are, I'm thinking of the Invitation with Eugene Peterson.
Yeah.
Where the prophets were trying to teach the Israelites what God was versus what the culture would constantly invade them with.
Yeah.
And how did he know that? I mean, what did he read?
Who?
The prophets, any of the prophets.
Well, they would have had these by then. I mean, that's not to say that they just some of these books were written. When I'm giving you these books, they were supposedly not only happened at that time, but written at the conclusion of that time. So when I say 2 Samuel, that was probably recorded in the early times of David's kingship and of his monarchy. So by that time, they were illiterate. I mean, David was composing, and they were, the civilization had developed at that point. But it's just the vast majority of the people did not have the capacity to be literate.
Or the Torah, which is the first 5 books, which I'm thinking about it, it was passed on either by oral
tradition. And
I don't know what time it was written.
And really the Levites became that scholar, and that's not just in that time, but really religious leaders for millennia have carried more the intellectual life of civilization. If you look back through the first 100 years of the Christian church, it was monks that kept the books. If you've ever seen the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, one of the main ways the Irish saved civilization was they hid biblical relics and documents and Bibles and all of these things. And so then after, I don't remember which war it was, but they bring all these things out and then we have records. So it's one of those things that, I think literacy was still there, early on, and obviously Moses wrote, but it just wasn't commonplace. So much of it was mediated through liturgy and ritual and community, and that sense of passing down from one generation to the next. There was a much deeper understanding of the story of Israel. But then again, we've looked at this whole.
Difference, even after the Ten Commandments with Moses and establishing the priesthood, that the role of priest was very significant along with the role of prophets.
What?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Did you have a question, George? Who said
No.
that? No. Okay. So those are the books up to this point. Let's go down to this line. So that's up there. Then you have a series of, I think, about 150 years where you have almost 200 years where you have 20, so after King Solomon, you have Jeroboam in the north and Rehoboam in the south. And now you have for the first time a divided kingdom. And this is pretty significant because the divided kingdom, there's the sense of, the Israel as the northern, even though it's called Israel, the southern kingdom was called Judah, that was where God's favor was. That's where Jerusalem was. So you have division developing there. And then you have two different kings. And the northern king experiences, like I've said, 20 bad kings. It's just all over the place bad. And the southern kingdom has, I think it was 12 to 8 was the count, if I recall. There were 12 bad kings and 8 good kings. But that's through that whole period where it says the bad kings up here. And then you have all the way to King Ahab and Jezebel, that they were bad. Leading up to where Elijah was. And Elijah does the sort of Baal story where it builds up the big wood sacrifice altar and challenges the northern kingdom. And then the prophet Elisha comes right on his tails. And what you have there is really the beginning of Kings 2. This is just in terms of tracking where the story starts. King 2 picks up with Elisha. And carries on. Now, what's interesting is as much as we get the story much later, Jonah, and we looked at that towards the end of the prophets, Jonah fits in right here. So this is, and what's interesting about that in particular is no one had, Assyria hadn't taken over, no one has fallen, and the prophet Jonah God is sending the prophet Jonah to Nineveh to basically proclaim that if they repent, they can be saved, or there can be some sort of redemption. And as we study, Jonah doesn't want to, goes in the sea, gets sort of turned around, goes back. And then later we find actually in Nahum, in 640, we have this sense, this reflection on the destruction of Nineveh. So Nineveh gets destroyed in the end, but again, just highlighting places where God is starting to show signs of including Gentiles or non-Jewish people into the story of redemption. Right after Jonah, you have the prophet Hosea. And if you remember, and that's that's just when the book was written, right after Jonah. You have the prophet Isaiah and Hosea, and Hosea was the prophet that talked about Israel being sort of like a harlot, that Israel has married itself to unfaithfulness. God is sort of the husband, and the wife is sleeping around with the Assyrians. So you kind of have this very Assyrian sentiment running through here and running through Hosea's prophecies. And then I think the year was around, and actually Amos is around here as well. Around this time, or of Hosea, they were contemporaries. And Amos, as we looked at, was again prophesying to the north and was telling the rich that they had taken advantage. And so Amos is that justice book that says, hey, you're violating God's call. And remember way back when God established the covenant with Israel, and they were supposed to go, and the irony of going in and conquering the Canaanites, but then also treating the foreigner with care, but God wanted to get established. And so, but that sense of that call to treat issues of justice was something that was very much so on Amos's time, and a prophecy against the corruption of northern Israel. And again, when I say northern Israel, you all know what I mean, right? That's that on your maps, it says Israel above. I'm not going to turn to that, but just that up near the Sea of Galilee. Samaria was up there. Samaria was the capital of northern Israel, which again puts context into the whole notion of that sort of anti-Samaritan sentiment that runs through the New Testament. The Samaritans were the wayward Jews that went off and did their own thing and aligned themselves with the Assyrians. Then you have the prophet Micah, and Micah was basically said that Israel will fall. And he was around the contemporary, the same sort of time. You have the prophet Joel, who prophesied about the locust invasion that came to kind of steer Israel back. And it was very apocalyptic and filled with judgment. And then you have the fall of the Assyrians around the fall of northern kingdom around 720 with the Assyrian attack. And then northern Israel is exiled. And so northern Israel has to go on, and the southern kingdom is looking at the northern kingdom thinking, oh, you messed up, you're not faithful to God. Where have you been through this whole process? And then you have King Hezekiah of Judah, who was a good king. He tried to institute reforms, very positive in that regard. And really, then you have the prophet Isaiah, and that's that book right there. And prophet Isaiah, if you recall, really pointed to Christ. That was that suffering servant. Isaiah was divided into 3 sections, and all of it deals with this sort of savior figure, in particular in the second section, Isaiah 55. And it really was looked at, and Israel thought maybe it was King Cyrus who sent them back from the Persian king who sent them back and allowed them to reestablish themselves. But we look at it now in this day and age as being really more about Christ and the call for that prophetic witness there. So let me move this over here. All right. Next line. What's that?
Southern Kingdom. Yeah, I didn't realize so much that he was really just to the Southern Kingdom. Yeah.
Who's that?
Isaiah.
Yes, very much so. Because he was prophesying, he was prophesying again, and different interpretations of the suffering servant between the northern and the southern kingdom, but in general, that a deliverer would come. But it was something that the northern kingdom was facing. The southern kingdom had yet to face that. All right, down to this next line. Boy King Josiah, he was young when he was put in. Nahum, oops, where's my thing here? Okay, so do Nahum. Nahum is here, as we looked at. Remember Nahum? And what did Nahum? I don't remember what Nahum. I wrote down. I can't even read my own writing. Nahum was the prophet that. Does anyone remember? No. I'm sure once I see my own writing, I'll. Nahum, difficult to understand. He's the one who prophesied about the destruction of Nineveh, or the idea that Nineveh became then sort of this example of God's punishment on the nations. After that, you have, you have Zephaniah, right? You have the prophet Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was the weeping servant, who was weeping over the Israel's, Judah's, the southern kingdom's, sin and idolatry and wicked leaders. And you have in that, though, the new covenant. This is the new covenant is here. And so in the midst of this horrendous, sorry, am I in your way? This horrendous sort of falling of Jerusalem, about to fall in this corruption, the prophet Jeremiah is predicting God's judgment and all the things that the other books do. But what he offers in the midst of that is this idea of a completely new type of relationship that God has with humanity. And that marks a pretty significant difference, because prior to this point, all of Israel was being judged by all of Israel. Even if you never sinned a day in your life, not that could happen, you were still receiving God's judgment because you were a part of Israel. And Jeremiah is the first to really crack that sort of door open to say, you know what? We're now going to be judged as individuals. Not that we won't have communal sins or communal connections, but we won't. But those things won't necessarily define us. You have Zephaniah right in here. Zephaniah. Who also prophesied about the judgment of Israel and the day of the Lord coming. So that phrase, the day of the Lord, really makes a prominent place. You have the prophet Ezekiel, who predicted or prophesied the end of the kingship. So the end of the monarchy of that was about to come. Also has that dry bones reference that was like, hey, Israel will be restored. Like there's hope for Israel still coming. Habakkuk, I'll just do that Habakkuk, there you go, HBK, was right in there, and also prophesying against Israel and saying that they're about to fall and this is about to happen. And then you actually have the event happen in 586. You have a massive invasion. You have the first wave of exiles being taken out, and this is where the Obadiah happens right after this, because the fall of Jerusalem happens here, and Obadiah is prophesying against the Edomites. Because as the Israelites escape southeast from Jerusalem and are trying to get out of the way of the Babylonians, the Edomites, remember, connected to Esau, were grabbing them and taking them back and killing them and sort of trying to win favor with the new political hierarchy. You also have Lamentations being in here, which was written by Jeremiah. So you have Jeremiah that sort of experiences, and Ezekiel, who both experienced the fall of the thing they were prophesying. They got to see it actually happen. And Lamentations comes back that. And this is kind of where the end of Kings happens. So the whole story of Kings goes up to this point. So that means everything that we've talked about, so now we have full circle, right? The story that Kings ended with, prior to the fall of, or right after the fall of Jerusalem, and that promise of it, all of the prophets that we've named thus far have come prior to that. And again, an Obadiah would have been here, and because of the Edomites. And then you have Daniel, and those are some pretty significant events, and that's where you get some of the apocalyptic stuff. Daniel happens in exile when under the Persian king, or actually, sorry, the Babylonian king. And then you have Haggai that comes right here, Haggai. And he was prophesying after Haggai. I'm getting them all confusing now. Haggai, he came in after the fall, and was sort of that first exiled prophet to speak to Israel. And his message, I was supposed to be going to do this right. There's no personal history there. It was sort of after the building of the second temple. So during this period here was the 70 years of exile. And then you have Haggai, who comes back right after the King Cyrus sends them back. And that's around 520. If you're just sort of tracking, that's around 520. And then you have the prophet Zechariah. And then which is here, and Zechariah was the author who basically after the fall as well was compelling them to complete the temple and is urging them to carry on. And then interestingly enough, despite the fact that it comes much earlier, you have Esther here. So that's when it actually would have been. So the story of Esther is this sort of Exodus, and it doesn't mention God, the saving of the Jews that remained in Persian territory. And on your maps, you'll see Susa. On this one, the farther to the left, I won't pull it up. So you have Babylon there, and you have Susa way over there. I say that, and I do, and then I feel bad. I feel guilty that I'm not showing you. Susa's over here, which is where it's thought to have taken place. Here's the Babylonian sort of center of power. As it becomes the capital at some point of Persia. And again, you have Jerusalem and Israel over here, and Judah. And this again was that Edomite here, and that's where the Moab. So, and then the Exodus came up this way. So all of this is happening, and really what is called by most as the Fertile Crescent. Like this whole area is considered the Fertile Crescent, or the beginning of civilization. And again, I said this way a long time ago, but I think it's interesting the fact that that Greek, so Greece being in this region as well. Up here, and really they conquered much more. Greece had a polytheistic understanding of the divine, of those outside. So they had all of these gods, And also, if you and they sort of settled here, but moving east, you have what eventually becomes the Hindu religion, also polytheistic. And to date, the only polytheistic in that way are Hindus and Greek mythology. But that's where you get that Greek movement of that polytheism, of that three gods in one, that allow this radical monotheism of Israel. Because there was multiple gods running through, all the early, ancient Near East, there were multiple gods. Baal was the god of fertility, rain, and this was the god of fertility, in the same way the Greeks had. But Israel worshipped one God. And so in this intertestamental period where the Greek influence happens, that's where you have that fusion of monotheism and polytheism in the shape of the Trinity. All right, we're rounding up. Okay, so Esther happens there. And that becomes a significant part of God's sort of provision, but it's kind of the way they stick it in the Old Testament. You'd think it would come much earlier in the narrative, but it doesn't. So it was around this time too that the Jewish canon was starting to be formed. So because as they went back, so the second building of the temple was happening, they were reestablishing. But remember, we talked that the reason that Zechariah had to get them and compel them to rebuild the temple is because they took some time off. And so there was that sense of, hey, we got to rebuild the temple. And when the temple was being rebuilt, then you have, here's Nora, you have Ezra here and Nehemiah, which are thought to be written by the same people. And then you have Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. And this happens actually, what would be considered about 100 years after the Haggai. So this is about 100 years after Haggai was right about there. So in this range, you have the rebuilding of the temple, and Ezra and Nehemiah are sent by King Darius, I believe at that point, to go back and to reestablish. And they really come back as in sort of a reform effort to say, let's rebuild the temple, let's reestablish it, let's reestablish who we are as a people. And it was around this time that Alexander the Great was also present on the scene, just to kind of anchor that. But what's interesting is this is the time that Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, was written. And Chronicles, again, details from Abraham up to the time of the kings. So there's a sense of second Israel, reestablishing, reinforcing the story of who they are. Because again, generation after generation, you have this sort of sense of judgment followed by redemption, God's faithfulness, Israel's rebellion, and it keeps in this secular sort of fashion. And that really happens, and it continues to happen up to this intertestamental period. And I believe that covers all of the books that we have looked at over this past 9 months. Yes, Bruce.
So the key point about the Messiah in the Old Testament, we first hear that really in volume from Isaiah. Is that correct?
Well, in volume, the
Yeah.
promise was with the seed of Jesse, though there was something about King David. It was an established line that became more important once Israel started to fall.
And they've been waiting for the Messiah since
Ever
then?
since, still today. Those who are adherent Jews,
Yes.
like Adam Sandler probably is not like, when's the Messiah coming? But those who are devout Jews would still be having that sense of anticipation for the coming of, and that's my personal opinion, is when Christ returns,
That's what they'll say.
then the Jews, and I think, and this is where as much as I think we look at the Old Testament and see this horrendous God that's doing all these things that we don't even want to talk about, or really take, and that's, we don't take in the fullness of who God is in the Old Testament. But I do hope that passage that says someday every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess, will ultimately be about the final judgment day, as God pulls back the clouds and we all stand before God, that only those who are truly reprobate and just reject God in that moment will be destroyed or sent to. And at that point, honestly, if you reject God in the face of God, I don't really care what happens to you. Nor will I think we'll care how the earth was created, or or what happened, the mysteries of the world, because I feel like we'll get into the presence of God and everything else will pale in comparison to that pure joy and bliss that's experienced. Themes that run through this whole thing, really God's faithfulness, God's covenant with Israel, and that really is the expression of that faithfulness, no matter how many times humanity and then Israel reject. And all through these prophets, you not only see Israel's judgment, you see through all of the major and minor prophets this sense of God's going to punish Israel, but God's also going to punish all the other nations. It is the ultimate story. And I remember when I preached that sermon on like the good will win eventually, like I missed my conclusion. I wrote it down and I just got off notes. Sometimes it happens. But that sense of this story is a promise that good is going to conquer evil in the end. It is the ultimate story of good will conquer evil. And it is the promise and really sort of almost like a history of God's intersection with humanity to remind all of us that no matter what, God will never abandon the project. So that sense, and it's easy to point figures at Israel and be like, oh, they just keep screwing up. But again, I go back to that fact that the Holy Spirit wasn't present there, and they just didn't know how to be. And I think humans have evolved since then. I mean, and even in our culture now, I think that we have evolved in empathy and love and care. I remember the first time I did a missions trip, I went to Romania, and I heard the testimony of a kid who, when he was 6 years old, his mother took him to the train station, said, "I'll be right back," and never came back. And another kid who was probably like the age of 11 or 12 came up to him, the kid's still sitting there on this train bench waiting. And this kid says, have you been here for a while? Yeah, your mom's not coming back, kid. Come with us. And they went and they became underground kids of Croatia. There's a whole epidemic there of this issue of just kids living in sewer systems because they're abandoned by their parents. So, and this was just a few decades ago that this sort of thing was happening, and probably is still happening today. So depravity, even though God's Spirit dwells, depravity and atrocity still exists in our world. But the fact that we are in a place in our society where we're saying, what does it mean to be who I am in relationship to someone who has less? What does it mean to be a part of a Western culture and looking at the rest of the world who is impoverished and has much more profound examples of depravity than we do? I think we're in this constant evolving process of actually bringing God's Spirit into the fullness of this world. So. Okay, final thoughts, questions? 6:30 on the nose. That's all I got. All right.
Question.
I'm going to stop it now.
Quick question.
Yes, go for it.
Who determined the order? Because you just reordered the sequence of these books
Well, I did
historically.
them
Why were
chronologically.
they not put in chronological order?
Well, they are ordered because what happened is they grew, and that's that Tanakh thing. They grouped the Torah at the beginning, and then you have the Navim, and those are the prophets. Those are sort of at the end, and then all the writings are in the center. So they organize them in a pedagogical way for teaching and instruction. History books, law books, writings, and then prophets. And so they're structured in that way for the use of reference, because they're not really looked at as one book. We call it the Old Testament like it's one book. It's not. It's 39 different books that are all have some overlap in them. So you can, and I was going to show you this. This resource here, this is great. I actually bought this at the beginning when we started this process, and this, and I used this to sort of just be a separate sort of refresher for me today. I kind of went through these one by one to kind of read them. The whole Bible is up, but these are, and this is on our. Let me stop this here. This is actually on our.